Hello, so welcome to our 7th Unseen Lunchtime discussion. If you don't know, this is being run by SAW or Shieldfield Artworks, which is an arts organisation based in Newcastle. SAW is really interested in art as kind of a tool to look at society and how we bring people together and maybe kind of question the good and bad things happening in society. And from that art, kind of move on to community activism and work out how we want to form a better community for the future. Our Unseen programme has been running for the last 7 weeks, and we have invited 10 artists to explore the kind of audio and visual communication of art. Obviously, during COVID, we've all been very separated, and we've only been able to enjoy art in a kind of on-screen sort of way. So it's all we really wanted to explore what this meant and how this changes our experience of art. So to do this in a quite playful way, we've invited 10 artists to each respond to an audio recording. 7 weeks ago, we sent our first artist an audio recording, which she then made an artwork from. That artwork was not passed on to the next artist, but our first artist, who's called Sharon, recorded an audio which described her artwork. That was then passed on to the second artist, who created a visual artwork from that, and so on and so on. So kind of creating an artistic kind of relay race which explored how we communicate in an audio and visual way. So this week our 7th artist is Francesca Willow, who is a dance artist, and I'd just like to thank you so much to Francesca for just kind of taking part and giving her time very, very generously to this project. So Francesca's a dance artist, and she specifically kind of seeks to connect with people on a non-verbal level, which is something that dance does really, really well. So we're going to kind of try and discuss that today and look at the artwork that Francesca's made. So this is the point where we get to reveal Francesca's artwork. Francesca's made a beautiful 3-minute long video, which we'll enjoy together, and then we'll kind of come together and I'll discuss it further with Francesca, and we'll maybe bring together for some questions. So I would recommend with this video, it is really beautiful and I've really, really enjoyed watching it, but you might want to kind of switch off the other faces of the screen at the side of the screen, because that could be quite distracting in this video. But yeah, let's enjoy this together. So that was Francesca's video, which was called Transmigration. Francesca, thank you so much for creating such a beautiful and soothing video, I found. Obviously, this is a very kind of, I mean, to my eyes, very complex to make a video that features dance and nature and memory and birdsong. What, how did you find the process of making it, and kind of what, I guess my question is really, I feel like you obviously planned the dance moves and you planned the location, but when we were speaking earlier, it feels like it kind of changed as it went along, and as it was edited and different elements came out of it.
Yeah, so I will say as well, I'm going to pop it on my Instagram page later, and I'm assuming it'll be on the Soar website as well if anyone wants to like watch it again, because I think it can be a little bit harder to watch on Zoom because sometimes there's like a slight delay, which is fine. But yeah, it was interesting. Funnily enough, I actually did not plan the dance. Well, I did and I didn't, because basically what happened is the audio, I think we play it at the end, don't we? But the audio I got at the time, in the first week, I was thinking a lot about collaging and ephemerality. Those are the two things that had stood out to me. Yeah, especially, well, firstly, ephemerality is like talked about in relation to movement and dance projects all the time, because most people experience dance through live performance most of the time. And so there's this like ongoing discussion about how dance is always disappearing and being created in front of you, and how it's inherently ephemeral because it's never the same twice. Even if it's the exact same highly choreographed piece, it's never exactly the same to do or to see. So I'm always like thinking about that, and then what does that look like when you make a dance film, which is a medium that exists, but there's just like larger questions because you're like immortalizing one time it was done. But I was thinking a lot about the idea of making a collage. So the only thing I knew, I kind of had location ideas, and I knew I wanted to film loads of stuff and sort of collage it together. So I did have in my mind like sort of movement language or like ideas of different movements. But only in the sense that basically I filmed loads of improvs. So they were all, yeah, initially it was about 40 minutes long, which I obviously I didn't plan for it to be that long. I always knew I was going to cut it down to about 3-4 minutes. So the first couple of improvs I did were completely sort of nothing, just like responding to the environment around me. I had music on, but it was very open, and I was kind of deliberately trying to not make dance about something. I was like, oh, it's quite fun to not have a definitive meaning and be more abstract. And then as I filmed more and more, I kind of knew in my head like, oh, I did this somewhere else like a couple of days ago, so I'm going to do it again. Like there's a bit where I do the technical term is an attitude and parallel in second position, but there's a bit where like I do it in about 3 or 4 different locations, and that's because I'd done it once totally improvised, but I'd watched that back and thought that looks nice. So I would be in the middle of an improv and be like, I'm gonna do that again, and then I kind of had an idea that I wanted to cut them all together. But yeah, it was a lot of it then ended up becoming influenced because I filmed a lot at Gosforth Nature Reserve. And there are so many birds there, and it's a big place for bird watching. And especially then when I started looking back on the footage, the bird sounds are so loud. And then actually things I'd filmed in other locations, there was loads of bird sound as well, or bird song, which I had been responding to, but also wasn't like 100% conscious of. So even bits I filmed on the beach, you'd expect the wave noises to be really loud, and I did sprinkle that in a little bit. But actually what was really overwhelmingly loud was the bird song. And I had just come off a project literally the week before, dancing for someone else, where we were being a flock of birds, or sort of that was the inspiration. So I think that was already like inherently in the movement as well. So I'm talking loads, but hopefully this makes sense. Yeah, and then that influenced like how the edit went, which was a lot more intense than I anticipated. I don't know why, because I've done film editing before, so I don't know why I thought it wasn't going to be a mammoth task, but it was, because every clip's like 2 seconds long. So suddenly you realize like how much it takes to edit when everything is so short. But actually it came out a lot in the sound edit, because I went out and edited all of the different sounds and took them out and really like upped the bird noises. So any sounds that I didn't like, I took those out and emphasized the bird noises, but they were all from the actual recordings from the days. Um, and then I put music in. The music that I put in as well, I like leveled it down so you could still like hear the mix. And also this is just like an Easter egg for me, but the musician whose music I use is also like a notorious bird watcher, and loads of his songs are called like Birds of Finland or like Migratory Bird Refuge. And so I kind of was like, he would enjoy this. So that was just like little something for me, but it felt nice to also use a musician who I know is like really inspired by birds as well. um so yeah, that was like sort of the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Mm.
I love how I, as a person who doesn't really know anything about dance, just thought it was all planned. Um, but I also found it beautiful that I could really see you responding to the landscape and being like, you have your feet in the sea and you have your feet on the soil, and just that relationship was really strong to me. And I also found it interesting that it kind of played with this idea of like liveness and something being live. Obviously, you're not in multiple locations at once, but it kind of felt there's this kind of rhythm to it,
Yeah.
which is, even though you're in different locations, because the locations are all very natural and some of your movements are repeated and the bird song is repeated, it has this kind of very soothing kind of effect, almost like this kind of lullaby effect, if that makes sense. And I found that really, really interesting. And I loved the bird song. It felt to me like almost like a film soundtrack
Mm.
kind of in the background. Um, yeah, it was just wonderful. I've watched it, 4 or 5 times now, so maybe I'm very soothed by it. Um, but as part of Unseen, we're kind of thinking about how we experience art and the difference between experiencing art in the flesh and on the screen. And with your video, what I was drawn to thinking about is how we would maybe experience it differently if we'd been in Gosforth Nature Reserve and we'd stumbled upon you dancing,
Yeah.
as opposed to seeing a video, and how our response would kind of vary in that situation.
Mm. Yeah, I've got lots of thoughts on that because the project I came off the week before is was very much like that. So this is something I think about a lot, because when you put art or especially performance in like an outdoor space that's not, people haven't designated the boundary in their mind of like, this is an art space, I feel like the reactions that people have fall into distinct categories, which happened at Gosforth Nature Reserve because everyone else is there with cameras as well, but they're there to like sit for 3 hours to try and spot like a woodpecker, and then I'm like dancing around. But because just before I was in Cornwall, and that whole R&D for that project was all outdoors because of COVID, but like really we were dancing on beaches and in like quite natural spaces, but then also like directly in town centers, which I've done before, so I'm used to it. But you can't, because you're in your like bubble of performance, even when you're interacting with the people around you who maybe aren't in the performance, it's still like inherently performative because you're not having like a normal interaction that you would have if you were just like walking to the shops or something. And I find you have like, yeah, they kind of fall into a spectrum of like people whose brains either immediately go, this must be a performance or this must be something, and like they put themselves in the role of audience member, which you didn't actually ask them to do. But like there'll be times when I've performed outside where a crowd will start gathering and we haven't been like, we're having a performance, everyone come over here, but people will be like, those people are doing something outside of the norm, so they just start making a crowd to watch you, and they are very like, stand still, stand quietly, like we'll make like a front, even though there isn't a front because it's not on a stage. Or you'll have people who like recognize this performance, but they like can't cope with that in their mind, and they deal with that by like trying to interact with you. Like I've had people come up to me to be like, do you guys have a mental illness? Or I had someone once being like, is this a prank show? Like what's happening? And they like are so confused that they channel that confusion to like shouting at you, but not necessarily like an angry way. They're just like, what is going on? And then you have some people that are like, I recognize that something not normal is happening, but I am going to pretend it's not, and I'm going to barrel on through. And like, I had all of those happen, but micro interactions, because it would be like one person or two people at Gosforth Nature Reserve when I was filming as well. And like, no one's ever rude. I've never encountered that. But some people are like, I'm gonna walk in front of that camera. I'm not stopping what I'm doing. And they like, or like when I was filming at the lighthouse, there was like there was some people on horses who went past, and I felt like they were trying to be really like a bit quieter. And then some guy came on a bike, just did not care. It came right behind me. um and so it's just really interesting. But I tend to just be like, haha, just doing some art, and then people tend to go, all right, okay, and like continue on their day. But it is really interesting because I feel like it really like lays bare these like unwritten social like codes that we've put into what it means to exist in like public space, which obviously is even more of a thing we're all thinking about now, because now we have all these things about the space that should exist between us and how we queue and how we are with other bodies in space. But it's just really interesting when you do something that completely disrupts that. um so also when I was making this whole film, I had people come with me even though I didn't really need help, because it was a camera on a tripod and I just need to press the button. But I would have like a parent come with me or a friend, so it would look like they were filming me, because I knew that that would look more like something that people would recognize as like a normal thing. um and normally they go, oh, it's a uni student, and they just move on. So even that, I was like aware that I was like, if I bring another person, I look less insane and more like I'm doing something that's legitimate. So it's really interesting, like things I think about all the time. But yeah, encountered all of those interactions.
Yeah, I find that that social construct of how people respond when art isn't in the place they expect it, and what happens to their reaction, really, really interesting.
Yeah,
But equally, I find it really interesting when people are freaked out by something, but then you can say, oh, it's some art, it's for an art project. And then people go, oh, okay, then. And they
yeah,
just accept whatever you're doing after that point in a lot of ways. And I find that really interesting, that we can put this label around something as art, and people will accept changes in your behavior that maybe they wouldn't if you were just like, well, this is just my day, this is what I'm doing. I find that really, really interesting.
mm.
I
And
also
there
find,
oh sorry,
go on.
I was just going to say, and there are some artists I think that are really aware of that and like push
Mm.
that on purpose. I don't feel like I'm at that point yet as on my own. In the project where I was with a group of people, it's easier because one person starts to sort of push and maybe do something even more strange, like climbing all over benches or something, and you kind of know you've got the group behind you. But it just reminds me, there's an artist called Richard de Dominici who makes very silly art with like quite like strong messages. So he I always remember he was doing a piece about something about travel and how he was trying to make commutes shorter, and there was a prison directly in the way of his walk to his wherever he's working. So he made this whole performance art piece where every day he would try and scale the walls of the prison and obviously fail to like try and walk through on the way to his commute. And he got away with so much because obviously eventually they came out and brought him in the prison and was like, what are you doing? And he got away with it by being like, I'm an artist. And then he was like, well, technically I succeeded because I was trying to get in the prison. I got in the prison. And just how much like some people really push it, and that being part of the art as well. I don't think I'm like quite at that place yet, but I'm like adjacent to that place, because also dance is like, people also have very strong ideas of what dance is.
Mm.
They either think it's like ballet or musicals or strictly come dancing, and like anything outside of that they're also like, what's that? So it's really interesting when you like then start rolling around or doing something a bit weirder that people can't say, oh, that is like a pirouette or something. You have that happening as well. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think generally as society we get freaked out when we can't label something. That
Yeah,
stresses us out. I don't know why, but we just stress out. But we have this nice label called art, which we can put a lot of things under that
yeah, it's
maybe
nice.
helps alleviate a little bit of that stress. Um, I feel like we're having a really rich discussion about the kind of social constructs of art and audiences, and I feel like the audience here probably have a lot of questions about that and comments. So I'm going to invite some in a little bit earlier than we maybe usually would. If anyone has any kind of comments on that or on Francesca's lovely artwork specifically.
What was the music that you started with originally in your head, or that you were playing right at the beginning?
Same artist actually.
What's the name of the artist?
His name is Connor Youngblood, but Connor is spelled with an E at the end, so Conner, and then Youngblood spelled like the word young and then blood. He's an American artist. I literally just found him because of like Spotify Discover Weekly. So, but it was only because I started to be like, who is this artist? And I started looking into his work, and then I found out about his like love of birds. And for me, I feel like he's like such an amazing musician, and I really like go through phases where I like to have music on in the background, especially if I'm improvising, that has some sort of drive, but also is quite open. Because obviously if you have something that's really, really beat heavy, that can really influence what you're doing. So yeah, he just works like perfectly with my like strange little brain to help. So there is like a few little moments, but it's really quiet, where little bits of other songs that I had playing in the background like make its way in, but you wouldn't know unless you really knew those songs and knew that I was dancing to them, if that makes sense.
So presumably you've talked to him about it, and in getting permission and everything, and
I didn't, but he's not a really large we have like communicated in the past, but he's not a super famous musician, and he's quite open, and he's like, if people need instrumentals of my music to use for a project, like please just email me. So it's like I didn't ask permission before, but I also know that he'll be okay with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Especially with it also being to do with birds. I feel like that's like all of his interests combined. But yeah, he's actually not like he's got like fairly good like Spotify monthly listeners, but he's not like Billie Eilish or something. He's like mega star.
No, it's always nice when you do collaborations with other people, and it does help you to learn new things and stretch your art yourself and things like that. And
yeah, and dance also is an interesting one. I still like, I'm not 100% sure what the like parameters are or like legalities of like how dancers get music cleared for work, because like for instance, like Sigur Rós, for a long time they were really specific about who could use their music. I think that's broadened up a little bit, but I remember for a long time it's like barely any TV or film was allowed to use their music. And I would see tons of dance pieces that would like have their music in it. So I feel like there's this weird like middle ground. If you're a really famous choreographer, a really famous dance artist, you'll collaborate directly with musicians. And then there's a lot of people who are in like medium companies, small companies, people making independent work, where they just pick any music they want. And I'm not sure what the rules are or the laws are around that, but it definitely happens. Something I should know more about.
there's a lot of grey areas, aren't there?
Yeah.
I've come across it with I've made some commissions for churches and things like that, where they've wanted words from worship music and things like that, and I've had to write to the author to say, can I use some of the words from your thing? So Graham Kendrick was one, and he was lovely, and he said, oh yeah, you could use any of my words for my songs, I really like your art, and that. Trouble is, he'd sold on his copyright for his songs to Kingsway Music. And so when I wanted to have some postcards made of it, I had to pay a copyright fee for the use of 6 words from one of his songs.
And it's really like, I don't like have answers to these like questions, but it feels like that is changing more as like the digital world expands. Obviously it's completely different, but on things like Instagram, people, when they make reels and make those kinds of, or on TikTok as well, that kind of content, it's like got a direct collaboration with Spotify. So you just go in, and as long as the music's listed, you can pick it and use it. And now I've seen quite a few dance artists over the pandemic who will take little pieces of choreography and put them on an Instagram reel or something like that, so people can still engage. But yeah, I don't know what the structure is of how that goes back to the original artist. So there's something I wonder about all the time, but
Are you in a guild or anything sort of that would have that sort of advice? Because I'm in Axis Art Guild, which covers all sorts of artists, and you can find out information through them about rates of pay and all sorts of things. It's really helpful, and plus you get insurance for public liability and all sorts of things at a really good rate.
dance is quite a strange middleman where technically you're under equity. Like most people wouldn't be a card carrying equity member, but equity sets rates. But then equity tends to set rates for other kinds of dance, like musicals. So you kind of have to go off. You kind of have to guess it a bit. Dance is a really strange, like, little side world because it's like a performance medium, but you don't have agencies like you would with acting, modeling, other things that are like body focused. So it sits in a bit of a liminal space, and also because lots of dance work is very like DIY, or it's a lot of small projects. It's only really, I think, big companies who are making either doing big commissions for festivals or theaters where it kind of becomes like more integrated into how the rest of the world works. It's just a very strange little beast that exists sort of over here. So that's
what
why
what you're doing comes under performance art, doesn't it, really? I mean, if I was doing that, I think I'd want to put a sign out in front of me sort of saying, I'm doing performance art, thank you for your patience, or something like that.
I think some people have some things to say, but I don't think I'm the moderator, so I don't know.
I think Sarah had a question, and then Lydia.
Yeah, it was just a thought. I was in an artist talk on Monday with someone called Aiko Atake, who's like a performance artist from New York, and like older lady, like in her 80s or something, who does work spontaneously on the street. And there was a photograph, like documentation, and there was three men in the picture, but the two on the left-hand side, some of the moderators said, oh, we know those people, they're like friends of the artist who've like known her for 20, 30, 40 years or something. And that the presence of like those people in the space watching, and then all of like the general public who encountered her, like there was a shift, between like the gaze of these old friends of hers who've seen her work and been with her for like generations, are going to have a different impact on the passerby who then like encounters the work, because they've established like a kind of a gaze or an encounter or a relationship in that public space. Just thinking about what you're saying about like taking people with you and how their like presence alters the space. The other thing I was thinking was like often on Zoom, like I feel like you can always hear like birds in the background sometimes in people's houses, or like cars going past, or that was reminding me of I was in a meeting last night, and I think there was like birds outside my window who were being really noisy, and like it's so loud that like we couldn't hear like whatever people were saying. But that in the footage with the sounds of the birds in the background in your piece reminded me of that kind of experience on Zoom, where you hear obviously like the sound of where people are.
Yeah, that is quite place-based as well, because one thing I found is Gosforth Nature Reserve is like fairly big, but it's not, it's not a huge national park or anything. And footage from different parts of the reserve, the bird song is completely different. So nearly all of the bird song that you hear, apart from little bits that might be like seagulls or things from the coast, a lot of it's technically in one location, but just walking like 10 minutes from like the reeds to the trees or to another part, and it was completely different. Obviously, that's why all the bird watchers go there. But me as like as a novice, it's like amazing. And also because they all layer on top of each other, and you're like, where are these birds? It's fascinating. So I feel like I've noticed that a lot more. It's also like a lockdown thing, like on Zoom, or also just when nobody was allowed to go outside. Things that I've never really have slowed down to notice in the same way before.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people during the beginning of lockdown were saying things like, the birds seem a lot louder. I can hear bird song all the time. And, but people were actually saying, well, actually the birds have been there the whole time. You're just noticing it because the traffic noise is less. And I find that so interesting that there's something in the background all the time, but we didn't notice it because we were focusing on other things. It's kind of like this sort of philosophical thing that seemed like really universal during lockdown. It's this universal thing that people noticed more, and it had always been there. We just hadn't kind of been able to hear because we were so busy with other things.
Yeah, and it actually links, like, if anyone wants to ever look into this more, it links to this thing called nature relatedness, which is like, sounds like a woo-woo thing, but it's actually like a peer-reviewed scientific area of study, where they talk about people who increase their like feeling of bonding towards nature, or feeling as inherently connected, rather than like nature's over there and I'm over here and I go there once a year, exhibit like better well-being, but also tend to act in more conscious ways towards the planet. And they were talking about a lot of that is increasing nature relatedness in your own self because it's already around you. It's more like, it's like breaking down that binary from thinking that it's over there and over here. And so I feel like that's also a way that people can, it's just about noticing. It's kind of mindfulness in a way, isn't it? Noticing what's already there, and understanding that you're actually interconnected with all these systems and species all the time, but we just don't realize. So it's really good.
Yeah, I think Lydia had a question, and then I'm going to come to Ken's comment.
So I know this piece you responded to the environment you were in, and that developed during that process. But I think you'd said some of your other pieces you'd had themes or things you were thinking about. So I wondered how you relate those themes into movement and how you develop movements and then the series of the movements, how that works.
In a normal, that's not, what does that even mean? Really depends on what I'm working on. If I'm working with like other ecological concepts, because especially like with this one, I think I would like to take it forward and do more with it. But I've been working a lot with ideas around like soil and ground and the scientific side of that, because I'm a trained soil advocate, and also like the more like spiritual side tends to be like a refining process of picking one really specific thing from a large body of information that you might have, and then being like, right, I'm going to do a choreographic task on that one thing. So I have like a video, I might have sent it when I did my application, of like a 5-minute performance that I did at Dance City, and that was as part of like a scratch, like work in progress. And so I was thinking about, this is very scientifically specific, but thinking about healthy soil that has high levels of carbon stored within it, is a lot more like gluey, and it has basically these carbohydrates and these sugars that are pumped down. And so I was thinking about this idea of gluey versus like if you think of loose dirt, and those two different sort of textures. And so I'm then translated that into a choreographic task where I was sort of, I hate to say like being the gluiness, because I hate when people are like, be a tree, but it's kind of like that. So I would think about two body parts and like, oh, what does that look like if they're glued together? And I would also try and pick like non-typical body parts. So it became a running joke because I have this piece where I'm like sitting and I put my knee to my forehead and then I straighten my leg, and then so I would do things like bring them together and pull them apart. So I was thinking of this like gluiness. I think that's a pretty like standard way of choreographing. Like you'll pick one thing and then develop a task around that thing. So when I've worked with poetry a lot in the past as well, which is something I've done a lot of, I'll tend to like pick out parts of a poem, and it might be one word or a phrase, and then be like, okay, well, how do I make a task about that? So for instance, like someone had once mentioned water and the water cycle. So I ended up making a whole task where it was like, what if I am walking in a circle the whole time and I'm like repeating movements? So it sounds weird, like you, when you go to dance school, you like train in how to think like choreographically and how to like come up with your own tasks. So it's different on every project. But something that I did forget to mention that I just remembered as well is that even though I was improvising, I think I brought that choreographic like mind into then how everything was edited together, because I had to think about what movements will go nicely in an order so that it doesn't feel like you're watching the same thing. Because obviously I had footage from this place, so I initially went through and cut it down to all the bits that I liked, which is quite nice because you can't normally like edit out the bit where you stumbled or your leg's not in the right position. But I could do that. And then I had to group them. So I was like, here's all the places where I'm turning. Here's all the places where I'm in arabesque. Here's all the places where I'm on the ground. And then I deliberately tried to mix them up so that I would be like, okay, so I'm standing and then I do some stuff and then I go down to the ground and then I come back up and then I do something else and then I go down to the, and so I was like trying to give it a flow as well. I imagine that's a bit like a movie edit, but you have a script to it. It's just a little bit easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that process is really, really interesting because I personally don't know how choreography works, but it strikes me that it's actually quite similar to how visual artists narrow down what they can express visually, and kind of do sketches and then move towards a larger piece. Ken has left a lovely comment about humpback whales and how we love
That'll be amazing.
and humpback whale sounds. And then I think Sarah has a question as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, not so much questions. It was more just thinking about the editing and like, because your movement, I mean, I've seen this before, is quite like placed and measured and like in a nice way. Like it's kind of like some improvisation can move quite quickly because the person is like overthinking or there's something quite like placed and measured, but then like the cuts were quite rapid, obviously like timed with the music, and that created like a part of the soothingness was that like things happened when you expected them to as well, like the movement with the cutting between the shots, coordinating with the music, and it's resonated with like a rhythm internally, I think, like seeing you move and seeing the shifts, the cuts with the space and how that fitted with the music.
Yeah, which was funny because I actually edited it all together and then put the music on at the end and was like, oh my gosh, this fits so well. And there's something really satisfying about that. And like, I think depending on the kind of artist you want to be, or the kind of, you can sometimes be like deliberately like, no, I'm going to go against that. But especially in these times, I was like, why can't I just do the satisfying thing?
It's interesting because like, when I've tried to like edit dance film in the past, like you end up, I don't know, trying to like feel a rhythm to it. I don't know, I'm not trained in film editing, but like I guess like our background is more movement, and so it's more like you're kind of like feeling a rhythm in the editing, like melodically.
I think that editing the rhythm then relates to how your rhythm moving in your dance, so I think it has the same mindset probably.
And I think because I was using the same musician throughout as well, or like at least at the beginning, and then I was more improvising in silence with lots of birds as it went on. And so obviously like I've got like an overarching like approach that will look different but comes into everything, and so does he. And so obviously it kind of makes sense that even at the end, even though I was dancing with different music of his, it like still fitted quite well together. Also, I just want to say, like, Louise wrote a really nice message as well. But I just thought I'd let you know I've read it, and that's really cool. But I understand as well about the editing. There's also when you're outside, you do lose some of the comfort of the studio. Like you have to dance in shoes, and there are some things you just can't do because it will hurt, or there's like you've got friction and things like that. So it can be quite nice. You've got restrictions, but then you can also edit, so you've also got more control.
It's interesting actually, because like when I don't know if you've had this, when I've danced in gallery spaces, I've also had the same reaction from people where they like start talking to you even in like a gallery space, and they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, we're in a gallery space. If it doesn't even that context like kind of negate that question. I'm just thinking back to what you're thinking about people's reactions.
People, like, if it's not like quite standard proscenium march, I think people can get quite confused, and that's not their fault. I think that just speaks to like the exposure that people have. Because at most of the stuff I've done, because with working with poets and stuff, has been in like weird poetry venues or like bars and cafes and all these different places. But because normally it is more of a setup of like, I stand at mic and talk, people respond, but still in like codified ways, like they'll snap and do all those classic like slam poem things. But it still means as a dancer that they're still like, even though you're in an unusual space, like if I just went into a cafe and started doing that and it wasn't already like codified as like, this is our poetry night, people would probably come up to me and be like, are you okay? So I think also it's like the parameters about what we've said in advance about the space as well, isn't it? Because people do talk in galleries normally because they might just be looking at something that's like more of an object. It's so like, I don't really have any answers for all these questions. I'm just like, what does it mean? Why does it happen? Why are people like this? Who knows?
I think they're all really, really interesting questions. And that thing about people talking in the gallery, so many times I've been in the opposite store and maybe like families come into the gallery and the parents will be going, kids, shh, 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 you can't talk, we're in an art gallery. And I'm just like, wow. Yeah, they can. They can, like, that's what the art gallery is for, is for A, looking at art, and B, you can talk about it. It's not like being in a library. Like,
no, it's funny that people have those classifications when ironically like most galleries coming back at the same time post-COVID as nightclubs, so maybe we need, people need to change their perceptions. But it's a bit like as well when you whisper to someone, how they'll automatically whisper back. Like you could be in a huge very noisy crowd, but if you're like hello, they'll automatically be like, I have to be quiet too. It's
Yeah.
really interesting.
It's very strange that I haven't done many I haven't danced in an art gallery or anything, but I have, when I was at college, I used to draw in art galleries, to like draw a piece of art you'd see. And honestly, the number of people that would come up to me and kind of just look at me oddly to say, what are you doing? I'm thinking, I'm drawing in an art gallery. Like, if there's a place to do drawing, this is the place.
Yeah. But then
Yeah,
if you change the cultural context like slightly, that's okay. Because someone was saying, what is it, like the Statue of David, like people are always sat around that, like trying to draw it. But then if you try to do that in front of like the Mona Lisa, which has always got this huge crowd of people want to take photos, people will be like, what are you doing? And so it's like you change the slightest, technically those are all the same scenario, but like all the other social boundaries around them make it like completely different.
yeah.
It's just wild. Like we made all the rules up from nothing.
Yeah. Who made these rules that we have to whisper in art galleries? That's what I want to know. Anyway, I'm aware that we're kind of getting really into discussion, so time's kind of moving on a little bit. I think we're now going to hear the audio recording which Francesca based her work on, which is by last week's artist, printmaker Erica Servin. So we'll just listen to that, and then we'll maybe have 5 minutes to kind of round up the last few comments and kind of questions.
Oh, sorry, wrong one.
Imagine if she'd also sent me birds. That would have been so funny.
I mean, nature has been a theme running through nearly every artist's work, which I find really, really interesting.
Mm.
I decided to start working with the words that I wrote after reading Ken's words. So the first idea that came about was to use collage as a way to inform the creative process, and I decided to use digital photographs that I had archived in my computer since I arrived in Newcastle 15 years ago. Well, no, not 15 years ago, since 2005 until now. So I went through the process of looking into the photographs and making sure that they wouldn't repeat. It became very hard to understand the process I was going through by revising the time, the spaces, the places, the people that had been in my life and the people that are gone or have moved on. And yeah, I just trying to understand what I am and where I sit and how ephemeral time can be and the presence can be, and how can it be recorded and archived and remembered and distorted. And yeah, I hope this is enough for you to develop your own story, history, your own nature, your own distortion, your own memory, your own identity, your own puzzle, your own fragment, your own change, your own feel, your own see, and that it can be preserved somewhere.
Thank you. So I don't know if Francesca, you just want to say for us 2 minutes, like how you reacted when you first heard that and kind of how, yeah, how that blossomed into the video.
Yeah, I'd forgotten as well, but I remember when I first opened it was so funny because the music started and I was like, oh my gosh, trying to make a musical piece for my audio. And then she started talking and I was like, okay. But I was like, there was a moment where I thought maybe she's gone really abstract with this and she's just sent me a 2-minute song, which would be fine. I thought of all the people to get this, a dance is the best person. But yeah, before she started talking, I did laugh because I was like, where's this going? But it's really nice actually. Yeah, but I think I had just like laughed listening again because yeah, collage was the main thing that I held on to. I think also I probably held on to that because I knew that that is a medium that's so much more or a way of working that's so much more familiar if you're working with like object or whether that's, you know, screen printing or painting or sculpture or, you know, any of those mediums that maybe people think of more when they first think of art. So that was why I'd thought, well, what does collaging look like in movement? And it has been, that concept has been used before in pieces, but also pieces that are quite famous. Like Sarah will know them, like from like the sort of Fluxus movement and stuff. Like I always think there's a piece called Accumulation where they're always like adding on and adding on and adding on. But that's also like a very famous performance. It's famous as a performance, not as a film. And obviously I kind of knew going in, whatever I do, I'm going to document digitally. So it makes sense to take the idea of collaging and not spend ages making a choreography where I'm adding things on and adding things on, but using collage as the way of like putting everything together. So the only image that I had in my mind from the beginning was this idea of it changing really quickly with me doing very similar things but in different locations. But I didn't know what that movement was going to be. I don't know if I've seen that. Maybe I've seen it somewhere in culture or in a music video or something, and it's in the back of my brain. But that idea immediately came to mind. So that was what I started with first. So I literally just said to my friend, because the ones that where I'm in the ocean are actually, I think you can tell they're when I was still in Cornwall, which is why the ocean's so pretty. And the friend who I was with, I said, I'm just going to film myself dancing loads in loads of places, and I'm just going to figure it out later. And then obviously it took on an organic route of its own, which was helpful, because you don't always have a guarantee also that's going to happen. But yeah, that was really all I took from it. And you are really lucky in dance that you can, at the end of the day, always just do improv and then figure out what to do from that. Like I've had that happen in live performances as well, where I've had a show. This does not happen in normal dance world, so don't apply this to your ideas of dance as a whole. But I've had shows where me and my friend have made like a 45-minute show and then we find out our slot is for an hour. And this is a poetry world, that's much more normal because you'll be told you have this amount of time and you just choose your poems. So she would be like, she would just add a few more poems in and I was like, I'll just improvise, like we'll put them here, here and here, we'll put this music on and I'll just improvise for 4 minutes, it's fine. So luckily, I mean, I went to a school that's very improv heavy as well, so you get quite comfortable with that. But I was lucky in that respect because it was a lot of work. Like editing is really like a lot of work, but actual dancing you can do so much in a short space of time, which is really interesting. Like I was on a residency once and someone else was on the same residency and they were both 6 months, but in the 6 months he made 5 sculptures and I could have made like hours of choreography in that time. So there's also like something fascinating there as well. Yeah.
Your movements when you were doing things, were you more in your headspace? Were you thinking more about what your body was doing or about responding to the environment? Because I noticed towards the end you got a lot of much more closed off things where you were kind of more fetal and more sort of closed in. I wondered if that was a conscious thing that you were aware of.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Nice to see you. Sorry, Sarah just had to head. Honestly, I think you can't like separate the two because, and this is another like improv trick from my dance school, when you're responding to the environment, my way that I get into that is more to do with like physical description, and then I let the sort of atmosphere go into my brain. I realize how silly that sounds. But sometimes that will look really obvious to me, but not to an outside eye. But I'll be like, oh, there's a tree, so I'm gonna like do this and then this. And I find that really helpful as a way to get in. If I think about how do I describe what I can see around me with my body, and then that sort of helps me get into the flow, and then I'll be thinking about things like the sounds and the smells and the things around me, and it's also a little bit hard to explain, like, because I don't 100% know how they influence, because it's very instinct led. But then things where it's like closed off, it's interesting because in another context with different music or something else, that could be really emotional, or like, this is me in my sad moment, whereas it was more exploratory, where it's like, I'm looking at what is on the ground, like I am, there's a bit where there's 3 cuts where I'm bent over, like as if I was touching my toes. And that first one was because I was dancing and I was like, there is a rock over there and I want to get on that rock. And when I watched it later with bird sound, it made me, it was funny because I thought, oh, that looks like a bird, like when it gets on its little perch and then just has a little chill. But it had just been because I was like, I really want to climb on that rock. And then I'd repeated that at other times because I knew in the back of my head I'd done that, and I thought that will look interesting. But you've obviously got no guarantee it actually will. But then also it's just a moment where you like just stop and look at the ground around you and like observe as well. So yeah, I think like all the other framing contexts can make that have really different like emotional resonances as well. Whereas more for me, it was all about like looking and observing. And so sometimes that's something really far away. So I'm like reaching out because I'm like looking at the horizon. And then sometimes I'm like, look at that rock on the ground over there. And so that in itself creates different scales, I think.
Thank you.
I'm really aware of time. We've kind of gone a few minutes over. So I'm gonna, unless there's any absolutely last minute burning questions, I'm gonna wrap up if that's okay. So I'd really, really like to thank Francesca for just talking so generously and putting so much work into editing and dancing and videoing, and creating such a beautiful artwork. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'd like to invite you all to next week's event, which is exactly the same time, exactly the same Zoom code, and we'll be talking to painter Sam Heath. I'd also like to plug the final event, which is on the 9th of July at 7 o'clock in the evening. There is a separate Zoom code which you can find on our website, and that event will be a kind of wrap up of as the project as a whole. And what we'll be doing is we'll be joining all the audios together in a kind of massive kind of art piece of audio, and playing that together, and also having a kind of joint discussion with all 10 artists, hopefully, if they can all make it. So please come along for that. I look forward to seeing you all, and thank you for coming today and having such a lovely discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go.
Bye.